Greetings, it is I, Countess Narab and Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It's time to continue my expose on the history of Magic the Gathering. Today I've got for you Prophecy. Now Prophecy was released on June 5th of 2000 and it had 143 cards. The keywords and mechanics included alternate cost cards, avatars, land sacrifices, mercenaries and rebels, spell shapers, Rhystic Magic, and tapped/untapped lands cards. Now, its symbol was 3 crystals, which represented Rhystic Magic. Now, this was, of course, the 3rd set in the Mask block, and the 20th expansion of Magic the Gathering to be released. It was infamous for being very disjoint in comparison to the last 2 sets in the block. It had very little connection in the way that the mechanics work, and it was not a natural evolution of the abilities and mechanics that had existed in the previous sets. Lead Magic designer Mark Goldwater actually calls it the 2nd worst design set next to Homelands because of this disjointed nature. It introduced a subtypes. An example of one of these would be the Hoser type. It's not really a type, but it was a type of card. Effectively, it caused negatives for a creature subtype. For example, they had Root Cage for mercenaries. It's doing bad things to mercenaries, specifically targeting them. Now, it was sold in 15-card booster packs with art from Avatar of Hope on it. It was also sold in 4 pre-constructed decks, of course a fat pack. And the pre-release card was also Avatar of Hope, but foil. There was a novel of the exact same name that was released along with it. The basic storyline has the country of Keld invading the continent of Jamora, and the 4 major city-states banding together in the Hippane League in order to battle against them and eventually drive them from their homeland, defeating the Celts. Now, it had very little effect, the set did, on tournament play, though there are a few cards which are known to be very good for tournament play still. Unfortunately, the majority of them just weren't up to snuff when it came to the actual standard tournaments at the time. Even now, many of them don't reflect that very well. Now, introduced a few new themes. It first introduced the anti-creature type, for example, the anti-rebel card Brutal Suppression. It was made to go against rebels. They also introduced Rhystic Magic. Rhystic Magic, when someone would play a Rhystic card, an opponent could pay an amount of mana to either lessen or cancel out the effects of said Rhystic spell. So effectively, it's forcing an opponent to have to pay mana in order for you playing the spell to cancel the effect if they don't want to have it going into play, or to prevent a creature from having an ability, for example. It also had a heavy theme of lands, with both land sacrifice happening a lot in the various cards, and an interesting theme of tapped or untapped lands, where if you had all your lands untapped, an effect would happen. If you had all your lands tapped, an effect would happen on a card. Granted, these usually were 2 different cards, but you could have them for either or, that depending on what lands you'd have tapped, how many of them or none of them, it would have an effect on what's going on with the battlefield and the cards that you're using. Now the set had 6 cycles. First was a cycle of avatars. They cost 2 mana and 6 colorless mana. Each avatar was quite powerful, but it also had an ability that when something was triggered on the battlefield in relation to your opponent, it cost you 6 colorless less to play. So effectively, a situation could occur on the battlefield making only cost you 2 mana to pay an avatar. That was the big advantage of them, because normally they would cost you 8. There was also a cycle of field spells, effectively enchant lands, which you could put on a land and then they would get an extra tap ability, making it more versatile to use that land. There was a cycle of flash enchantments, creature enchantments. These were based off of the names of legendary spell shapers from the set. There was a legendary spell shaper, which is the next cycle I'm talking about, of each color, and so these were the enchantments based around them and their abilities. Let's talk about that cycle of legendary spell shapers. Each one of them cost 2 mana of the color of the card and 3 colorless mana, and you had to discard 2 cards to them. And you discarded 2 cards for incredibly potent spell shaping effects. Then there was a cycle of pitch spells, spells that you could discard a land of the appropriate color to whatever the spell was, and you could basically pay it without paying its normal mana cost, or for cheaper. There was also a cycle of winds. These were spells, powerful spells that had a converted mana cost of 9, that when you'd get them off, they had incredibly powerful effects across the battlefield. Now, there were 3 vertical cycles. There was a cycle of glittering cats. Effectively, each one had an ability that the combat damage would be prevented to them, but any player could pay an amount of mana in order to cancel this out until end of turn. So there was a cycle of these cats. There was a cycle of spiketails. The spiketail creatures, you could sacrifice them to counter a spell unless an opponent paid a certain amount of mana. The bigger the spiketail, the more mana the opponent had to play, but there was a cycle of them. And the final vertical cycle was a cycle of brawlers. The brawlers had a special ability that they couldn't attack, 2 special abilities. They couldn't attack an opponent unless they had all their lands tapped, and they couldn't block for you unless you had all your lands tapped. So it was a matter of having all the lands tapped, whether they could be attacking an opponent or defending against an opponent in battle. Now, there were 2 mirrored pairs. There was Rebel Informer and Mercenary Informer, and there was the pair of Soul Charmer and Death Charmer. Now, the pre-constructed decks were a white-black one called Distress, a green deck called Pummel, a red-green called Slither, and a white-blue called Turnaround. Let's talk about some cards from the set. There was Abolish. This was one of the pitch spells where you discarded a plains instead of playing its mana cost. You destroyed an artifact or enchantment. Avatar of Woe. This is the black avatar. It was a 6/5 fear. And you could tap to destroy a creature. It can't be regenerated. It costs 6 less if between all the graveyards in play there are 10 creatures in it. Then it would only cost you 2 black mana. Barbed Field. This was one of those enchant lands. This one gave your lands the effect that it could tap to deal 1 damage to target creature or player, making a ping land. Blessed Wind. It's one of the winds. Target player's life total becomes 20. It's good to counteract perhaps a life-gaining deck or to heal yourself up if you've taken a lot of damage. Calming Verse. When you play it, you destroy all opponents' enchantments in play. Then, if you have any untapped lands, you destroy your enchantments. So if you manage to tap out all your lands, you only destroy all of your opponent's enchantments that are in play. Chilling Apparition. It's a 1/1, 1 black mana regenerator that when it deals combat damage to an opponent, they discard a card. So it was a discard creature with regeneration. Citadel of Pain. At the end of each player's turn, Citadel of Pain does X damage to them, where X is the number of untapped lands they control. Denying Wind. This is a very powerful win. You search an opponent's library for up to 7 cards and remove them from the game. The opponent shuffles the library afterwards. So effectively, I can just pick out 7 key cards from my opponent's deck and remove them from the game. Despoil. Destroy target's land, its controller loses 2 life. A simple and decent land destruction card in black. Devastate. Also destroy target land, but then Devastate does 1 damage to each creature and player. So you blow up a land and deal 1 damage to everything. Dual Nature. When a creature comes into play, you put a token copy of that creature into play. So you get 2 creatures for the price of 1. If Dual Nature leaves play, any of these copies that were created by it are exiled. Or if the original creature that was copied leaves play, then the token is exiled. But this is a really cool way that you can effectively double your creatures when they come into play. Endbringer's Revel. For 4 mana, you can take a creature card from your graveyard and put it in your hand. The caveat here is, any player can use this ability when they can use a sorcery. So it means you're effectively putting an enchantment that everybody can resurrect their creatures. Entangle. Target creature can block, enchanted creature can block any number of creatures. You effectively can make a single creature be able to block everything. Living Terrain is an enchant land. Enchant land is a 5/6 tree folk that's still land. Magenta the Lion. This is the white spell shaper. He's 3/3, white legendary spell shaper I should know, for 3 colorless and 2 white, discarding 2 cards. You destroy every other creature in play other than Magenta the Lion. So he kills everything else but himself. Mirror Strike. You can have target creature deal combat damage to itself equal to its own power rather than deal damage to you. So effectively you can have a creature kill itself or at least damage itself. Overburden. When a player puts a creature card into play, they have to return a land to their hand. So this means if you're not doing something like, let's say with tokens, and you're just doing a lot of creatures cards, you kind of have to keep bouncing lands to your hand in order to keep playing them. Pit Raptor. For 2 colors, 2 black, he was a 4/3 flying first strike creature. But you had to pay that mana cost every turn. So he wasn't bad, but he wasn't great. He was fairly cheap for the abilities he got, but you had to keep paying that mana cost. Plague Wind. Destroy all creatures you do not control. They cannot be regenerated. It is the powerful Black Wind where you wipe out all of your opponent's creatures but save yours. Psychic Theft. You can look at target opponent's hand, exile a card from that. Until end of turn, you may play that exiled card as though it was in your hand. If you fail to do so, it is returned to that opponent's hand. So effectively, you can try to steal something from your opponent and then play it. Pygmy Razorback. It is a 2/1 common with trample for 2 mana. It's pretty good in one, like if you're playing, let's say, a Pauper deck. It's actually not a bad card to have, especially if it's a green one. It's quick and it's trample. Revile Squadron. As long as they are untapped, and when you are attacked, you may untap all your other creatures. So you leave Revile Squadron, they're untapped, ready, so that when you're attacked, you could have been using all your creatures. They all untap. Rhystic Study. This is my favorite of all the Rhystic cards. I don't really use it anymore because there's more efficient cards, but for the time period, it was pretty good. For whenever an opponent would play a spell, unless they pay 1 colorless mana, you may draw a card. Which means that every time an opponent plays a spell, you could possibly draw a card if you choose to. Granted, they could spend that extra mana and prevent that option, which you could just ask them every time. Did you spend that extra mana? Oh, I get to draw a card. Rhystic Siphon. This is a Rhystic spell which deals 5 damage to target opponent, and you gain 5 life. They may pay 3 mana to counter the effect of it. Rhystic Tutor. This allows you to search your library for a card, put it in your hand. Again, because it's Rhystic, your opponents may pay 2, or one of them may, in order to counter the effect of the spell. Search for Survivors. Shuffle all the cards in your graveyard, and have an opponent draw one at random. If it's a creature, you may put it into play. Otherwise, it gets exiled. So you have a random chance of bringing back a creature from your graveyard in red. There's Shieldbearer. It is a 1/3 white creature that for 2 colors and a white, you can have target creature that it is blocking deal combat damage to itself instead of Shieldbearer. So it's similar to that Mirror Strike from before, but in creature format. Spore Frog. It is a 1/1 frog you can sacrifice for the effects of a fog spell, preventing all combat damage in a turn. If you have a Graveyard Resurrection deck, you can constantly be getting back Spore Frog. I still use it in my green-black deck because it's very useful. It prevents damage if you need to. It has that fog effect. Squirrel Wrangler. For a colorless and a green, you can sacrifice a land to get 2 1/1 squirrels. Or for a colorless and green, you can sacrifice a land to give all squirrels +1/+1 until end of turn. You create squirrels and make them bigger. Sunken Lands. It's an enchant land that you can now tap the land to counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. So you can make your land just sort of eat up one of the opponent's land. Thresher Beast is a 4/4 beast that when it becomes blocked, an opponent has to sacrifice a land. So it's a 4/4 beast that opponents really don't want to block. But eventually you need to because it does a lot of damage. It's a 4/4. Well of Life. At the end of your turn, if you control no untapped lands, you gain 2 life. It is like the ultimate example of the keeping all your lands tapped abilities that seem to be prevalent in this set. Gaining 2 life for having it. So that's it for today. I introduced you to Prophecy. Granted, a lot of these cards that I talked about aren't incredibly powerful. I like a lot of them. I did at the time, and I did use a bunch of them. Very few I actually use nowadays because the evolution of cards has made them very well obsolete, including the ones that could be actually called half-decent at the time. Still, the set has some interesting abilities and interesting way of doing things. Granted, yes, I can see that it was not nearly as powerful as some of the other sets, and design just wasn't up to the snuff of some of the previous sets that existed now. But it does have a place in the history, and it does show off some very interesting concepts from the avatars to the winds that actually have been repeated in certain ways. You have the ultimatums, which appeared in Alara block, which mimic in a little way the big casting cost spells that mimic the set groups. So again, things existed in those. Regardless though, if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and of course subscribe. It shows support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon, link description below. If you were looking for some more magic content, and I'm not around to give it to you, you can always check out Card Bazaar, They Said We Said, and Tasty Snackies, my friends in the multiverse. I always recommend checking their great stuff out too. Magic related, of course, and otherwise. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.